Hey guys, it's Cass. Long time no see. I hope you're all doing well. I feel really out of practice. I feel like every time I film a wrap up, I'm like, wow, I feel like I just filmed my last one from the previous month, but I feel like it's been so long since I have sat down to film anything at all, let alone the May wrap up. Feels like it was created in a completely different universe. If you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen that me and my friends took a long weekend trip to Chicago last weekend, which was a lot of fun, and there will be a vlog coming up about that. But yeah, I wanted to film and edit a video and have it scheduled to post while I was gone, but life has been lifing recently and I just was not able to do that. But we're back with a June wrap up. Luckily, I have continued to read, and I feel like been using reading as kind of a escapism method these past couple weeks. So yeah, I am going to talk about what I read in June. We'll start off as usual with my Storygraph stats. I read 9 books in June, which comes out to 2,172 pages. This month, I actually read 100% fiction, which I did not realize that was how things were going. I usually have a much more even split between fiction and nonfiction, but I guess I was just really in a fiction mood this month. 3 of those books were from NetGalley. 2 of them I had already owned. 2 were from Scribd. I had 1 physical ARC and 1 book from the library. The first book that I finished was Practice by Rosalind Brown. I received this on NetGalley from FSG, and it was just released on June 25th. Practice is a pretty short novel that follows a day in the life of a student at Oxford named Annabelle. She's studying English, and we are with her from the moment that she wakes up in the morning until she goes to sleep that night. It is the winter of 2009, and she is trying to write an essay about Shakespeare's sonnets. She has the deadline for that looming over her head. She also has an older boyfriend that she's trying to kind of figure out where she wants things to go with, and we really just see her trying to stick to a routine and be productive. So like I said before, the book is pretty short, but it is also very intimate and detailed and kind of this close-up look at Annabelle. Since we're kind of in her mind, we are thinking about what it means to be in a body. We're looking at desire and productivity and how those forces can kind of clash with each other and how they both can influence the things that we do in our day-to-day life, and also just how easy it is to get distracted by little everyday things. I feel like this was kind of a quintessential no plot, just vibes book, which I typically love, and I really enjoyed how detailed and descriptive the writing was in this, but I just felt a little bit too detached from Annabelle as a character to fully connect with this one, so I did give it 3 stars. It was written in the third person, which I think could have something to do with that kind of disconnect that I was feeling. She was pretty relatable at times. You know, we see her struggling to kind of stick to this routine, and I know that I am also very guilty of getting distracted and just kind of not following through with the routine that I have envisioned for my day. She also really has a lot of appreciation for the little things in her life, making coffee, taking walks, doing yoga. We get kind of a detailed look at that, and you know, those are things that can just make our days better, even though they're these little things. So I like that kind of perspective and that look at those things. And yeah, I've seen a lot of comparisons of this with The Guest Lecture by Martin Riker, which was one of my favorite novels that I read last year. And I can kind of get that comparison, but The Guest Lecture was just a lot more interior, and it just felt like we were way more in that main character's head than we are with Practice. So kind of some differences there for me personally. I think the other thing that kind of threw this one off for me was that parts of this are really focused on these imaginary characters of the scholar and the seducer, and it almost reminded me of some of the like fantasy scenes in Checkout 19 by Claire Louise Bennett, which I talked about. What month did I read that? Which I talked about, I believe, in my May wrap up. So Annabelle has these characters of the scholar and the seducer, and they kind of accompany her in her imagination throughout her day, and she makes up these stories about them and their relationship with each other. And there are really big portions of this book that are devoted to those two characters. I personally just preferred the sections that were more focused on Annabelle's exterior life and her like writing process more than these kind of imaginary characters that she was thinking about throughout the day. I do think that they were kind of a good demonstration of her struggle to balance her academic life with her desire and, you know, her kind of romantic sexual fantasies. But I just, for me personally as a reader, I always tend towards like the more realistic than I do kind of the imaginary or like fantasy thing. So yeah, overall, I would say that Rosalind Brown is a really promising writer. This was a really promising debut novel, but it just didn't 100% nail what I wanted from the book. But I will be keeping an eye out for her future work because I think that she shows a lot of promise. And I have a quote for this one. It says, "And every day she has to catch and deal with little wisps of resistance, but broadly, there it is. The routine is well established. It gathers and directs all her various strengths and susceptibilities." Next, I read Parade by Rachel Cusk. This was actually a reread. If you have not seen my Rachel Cusk video, please go and check that out because I talk about this book for a solid half hour and I'm not gonna rehash it here. So yeah, this was a reread. I read this for the first time right at the end of May, and then I picked it up again in the beginning of June to prepare for that video. I rated this 4 stars and it was quite a challenge. And yeah, I'm not going to get into it here, but this was the second book that I read in June. The third book that I read in June was The Material by Camille Bordas. This was originally sent to me as an ARC from Random House, and then I also received a finished copy of it, which I have here. So thank you to Random House for sending this over. I believe this published on June 18th, I want to say, somewhere in like the middle of June. I rated this 4 stars. This was a really enjoyable read for me. This was one of those books that I just really looked forward to picking up anytime I got a chance to read. One of the things that I've noticed in my reading in June is that I've been really gravitating towards just reading one book at a time, which is so different from how I normally operate. I usually have like 3 books on the go at once, but I think rereading Parade by Rachel Cusk, I wanted to kind of give my entire focus to that book. So that was the only thing that I was reading in the beginning of June. And then once I finished that, I just kind of continued with that throughout the month. So yeah, every time I went to read, this was the book that I was picking up, and I was always really excited to find out what was going to happen next. This is a book that I would consider like a romp for my taste. It's probably as close to like a fun, lighthearted romp as I'll get, even though it does deal with some pretty heavy topics. I think that it really does those darker topics with the right balance of like humor and levity. This is about a stand-up comedy MFA program in Chicago, and we have a cast of characters that are all dealing with their own issues. We get to look at some of the professors as well as a bunch of the students' lives, and they're dealing with fraught family relationships, depression, loneliness, and they're kind of using these experiences as material for their stand-up comedy routines. This book, like Practice, takes place over the course of one day in their lives as well, which I feel like I usually really enjoy that as kind of a setup. I feel like this is just really asking like, how do we deal with the things that happen to us? How do we cope with difficult issues in our lives, who has the right to turn certain stories and anecdotes into jokes and like tell those stories as their own. And I feel like it was a really fun and touching look into the ways that we connect with different people, especially those that we're kind of in forced proximity with, in this case because of school, but that could be because of like a job or even like family situations where you are in the same situation as a person, so you kind of have to find ways to connect with them. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that there are a bunch of like images in here. There are some references to like different memes and internet things in this book, and there are some photos in here so that you kind of know what is being talked about, and I really appreciated that. I wish that more books did that because I do not always like pause my reading to go and look things up in the middle of my reading experience. So it was really nice to just have like those pictures in here so that I knew exactly what was being referenced. So yeah, like I said, this has quite a big cast of characters and we do get insight into all of their lives, but there were a few that I wish we had gotten a little bit more backstory for. Some of them felt like they were just kind of there, which I guess makes sense. You know, you have your main characters and then your like supporting characters, but I remember the character of Phil in particular. He was kind of always the butt of a lot of people's jokes, and I just feel like we didn't really get much about him, and I feel like it would have been a bit more fleshed out if we had some more of his perspective and his backstory in there. So he was like one particular example. I also wanted a little bit more of like a resolution from the ending of this book. I'm not someone that needs like all of the answers laid out for me at the end of a book, but the end of this one just felt a little bit like unsatisfying for me. But like I said, the story does take place over the course of a day, so it does kind of make sense that we don't get these like neat tied up ends. I thought that this had really great writing and storytelling, and that mixed with the dark humor made for a really good example of like how to do a funny literary book. The next book that I read I had picked up from the library, so I don't have it anymore, but that is The Hearing Test by Eliza Callahan. I rated this one 3 stars. I had higher hopes for it that just ended up not being met. The narrator of The Hearing Test is diagnosed with sudden deafness one day, and she kind of ends up keeping this record of the year that follows. So she's ruminating on the meaning of silence, how people connect with each other, and just how we view the world and how our senses impact how we view the world. I really liked the writing style of this book. There were comparisons to Rachel Cusk and Clarice Lispector, so I was really excited to see those comparisons, and I can understand where those are coming from, but the book just left a little something to be desired for me, I think. Callahan kind of obscures character in this book in a way that's really reminiscent of Rachel Cusk's recent work with Parade and Outline. So I'm wondering if maybe I just needed a little bit more separation in between my 2 read-throughs of Parade and this book, because I can see like a lot of similarities between the two. But yeah, I just felt really disconnected from the characters in here, and it kind of lessened my enjoyment of the book. If you do pick this up, I would recommend trying to read through it in one sitting. I think that that would have been maybe a bit better of a way to digest the book. It is pretty short, and it does have this kind of stream of consciousness style, so I feel like if you can just like sit down and kind of get into the flow of it and read through it, that might be better than breaking it up into smaller sections. So this was another promising debut, and I'm gonna kind of chalk up my feelings about it to like user error or like just wrong book at the wrong time. I think if you have an afternoon to get lost in the prose and the ideas that she's presenting in this, then you'll have a lot better of a time than I did. Next, I read another little short book. This was on script, so I read it digitally, and that was The Promise by Silvina Ocampo. I also rated this one 3 stars. I feel like I was kind of in a weird place in the beginning of the month as far as my enjoyment of what I was picking up. This is another really short book. It's more of a novella than a novel, and it is about a woman who falls overboard a ship and she's drifting to the bottom of the sea, and the book is just kind of made up of this like collage of descriptions of people that the narrator knew in her life. It really was not focused on the narrator's actual situation. It was just more of like her memories and these descriptions of people. The main part that I really enjoyed was the section at the end where she's kind of ruminating on memory and the passage of time and the meaning of life, and it gets a bit more stream of consciousness, and it was very reminiscent of Clarice Lispector for me. I really enjoyed that more so than these descriptions of these random people that she knew. It was really dreamlike and kind of fragmentary. It was going back and forth from person to person. There are some really like repetitive parts, which I think the interesting draw of this book for me is that the author spent the last like 25 years of her life working on this, which is crazy because I think it was like around 100 pages. So I think that things were done very deliberately as far as the repetition and the word choice and stuff like that. But yeah, once again, I just kind of felt this like disconnect from the main character, and it just didn't 100% work for me. But I do have a quote from this one as well. She says, "I'm inhabited now by infinite people who disturb my memory. I'm living off other memories. Which one am I? Sometimes I can't find myself." And I feel like that is just kind of like the thesis of the book, where she's like just built her life around other people, and she is having trouble like differentiating what her life is from the people that she knew. So I don't know, it was interesting. It was a quick one, but wasn't my favorite. And then I read Woman Running in the Mountains by Yuko Tsushima. I rated this 4 stars. I had a really good time with this. It is really beautifully written, translated from the Japanese by Geraldine Harcourt, and it also has an introduction by Lauren Groff. And this is a year in the life of a single mother and her newborn son. This book opens with our 20-year-old protagonist, Takiko. She's going to the hospital to give birth all by herself, and it is this really hot and sweltering midsummer day, and she just kind of takes up this struggle against all odds to raise her son on her own. And in Japan, especially around the time that this was written, I guess that it was very rare for there to be children raised outside of a traditional marriage, and she ends up facing a lot of intense criticism and abuse from her family, especially her father, but she has to stay with them as she kind of searches for a way to survive on her own. She needs to find a job and figure out how she's going to make a living and also pay for childcare. I thought that this was really intriguing because she kind of grapples with this ambivalence towards motherhood, but she also has just this really intense will for both her and her son to survive. So there were some kind of like conflicting feelings that she was dealing with that I thought were really interesting. I feel like a lot of the times with books like this, it's like kind of one or the other, where the character either kind of doesn't want children at all, or they're very like into it, and she kind of struggles with both sides of that coin. And I thought that it was really interesting that we were able to see how little progress has been made since this was published, especially like economically. It was pretty much impossible for her to pay for a home of her own and also afford childcare at the same time. And I feel like that is something that a lot of people also still deal with today. This was first published in the 80s. I think that the time period that it's set in is probably a little bit earlier, maybe like the 60s. She also talks about her desire for one of her co-workers who is married with a child, and she really bonds with them as they talk about their children, and I think she kind of sees him as sort of a mirror for like herself as a caretaker, and also sees him as like kind of a father figure for both herself because her father is very abusive, as well as for her child because his father is not in the picture. So I really enjoyed the writing style in this. I feel like I usually do with books that are translated from the Japanese. I thought that it was really beautiful and descriptive without being overly flowery or like difficult to understand. Some of the things that really stuck with me from this book were the descriptions of light and greenery and like plants in this, and the way that those two elements interact with each other. There is this description of a tree that was outside of her hospital room window, and it talks about like the leaves reflecting the sun and just how like shimmery and ethereal and beautiful it was. And I just really enjoyed reading that and hearing those descriptions. I do think that this could have been a bit shorter. It did get repetitive at times, but then again, I guess life is also quite repetitive, especially whenever you're in the throes of early motherhood and you're trying to kind of figure out where your footing is within the world. I thought that this was a really good like warm weather read because a lot of it does take place in the summertime. There's a lot of description of like weather and setting in here, and I think it was a really good complement to the other like motherhood related books that I've been reading recently, just because it did kind of offer that different perspective with the narrator just really wanting her and her child to survive, but also feeling that kind of ambivalence towards motherhood. I have a copy of Tsushima's other novel, Territory of Light, so I'm looking forward to picking that one up eventually. And I have a quote for this too. Squinting at its brightness, Takiko descended the slope. The sun was shining directly before her, full onto her body. She smiled. No one was aware of her joy at this instant. Not her mother, not her father, not a soul. She didn't think there could be any moment more luxurious than this. The sunlight felt good on her body. A hot midsummer's day was about to begin. Next, I had a 5-star read, finally, and that was The Last Sane Woman by Hannah Regel. I read this initially on NetGalley from Verso, and it was just published on July 2nd. I just got my copy in the mail from Barnes & Noble, literally opened it up right before I sat down to film this, so I'm really excited to have this because I absolutely loved this book. It was just one of those books that just worked for me, you know? Sometimes you just click with an author and a writing style, and that's what happened here. I absolutely devoured this. I started it during a morning off from work. I had like a half day, and then I almost read the entire thing in one day. The power actually ended up going out for a solid 24 hours in my apartment, and I had this downloaded on my e-reader, and I just sat here in the dark and read this the entire evening because I couldn't really do anything else. I feel like it really says a lot that I pre-ordered a physical copy of this while I was in the middle of reading it digitally because I just really wanted to have this book with me. This is about 3 different women. We have Nicola, who is in like the present day. She is feeling kind of lost and directionless. She just finished her degree at an art university. And then we have Donna, who was a sculptor who was creating in the 70s and the 80s. And she's just kind of drifting from opportunity to opportunity, staying with different people, working on different projects. And we also have Donna's best friend, Susan. She's leading a bit more of a conventional life. She has a house, a husband, a baby. They all kind of come together when Nicola discovers letters that Donna wrote to Susan in this feminist art archive that she is interested in. And she becomes really obsessed with how similar her and Donna are. I thought the writing in this was just delicious and wonderful. It is so rich and detailed, and you can really tell that the author, Hannah Regel, was a poet before she wrote this novel. And I mean that in the best way possible. I feel like people talk a lot about poets that write novels and just how there's something just a little bit different in the way that they use language. And I feel like that really was the case here as well, and I loved it. We are kind of floating in and out of scenes in all of the women's lives. We're getting these excerpts of letters that Donna wrote to Susan, and it really just made it such a page turner for me. I saw some reviews that people kind of struggled with the format and had a tough time figuring out the structure of it with the 3 different women's lives and their letters, and they had a difficult time following that. I didn't. I loved it. I feel like the novel is better for having that format. I think if it was more of like a straightforward linear, just like here is what happened, it wouldn't have been as good. There are a lot of like supporting characters and other people that the 3 women know that really I thought fleshed out the reading experience. I think it becomes pretty evident like who is the most important to pay attention to, but I feel like having so many supporting characters made this really vibrant. And yeah, this book is exploring female friendship, trying to find your purpose in life, and that struggle of, you know, whether or not you want to live this traditional domestic life or kind of go the creative route. And another thing that this looks at is the way that female artists often kind of live in obscurity. The book kind of hinges on Nicola not knowing who Donna was, because she signed all of her letters to Susan with just like love, kisses, like she didn't use her name whenever she signed off, and the curator of the archive didn't remember Donna's name. So Nicola is trying to figure out who Donna is. We know who she is because we're getting, you know, scenes from her life and stuff like that. That theme of like female artists in obscurity and their kind of impact being erased really made me think of another favorite book from this year, My Death by Lisa Tuttle. I would say this is kind of like the contemporary counterpart to that, but it's just a little bit less like metaphysically weird and strange. If you've read that book, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about. This doesn't get crazy like that, but I think that it explores a lot of the same themes. You know, it has that same thread of like finding an artist that you really connect with and you kind of feel like you're one and the same with them. And I think that the format of the letters that are used in this book, it leaves a lot of gaps for Nicola as she's reading through the letters in the archive, and she's kind of projecting herself onto Donna and filling in those gaps with like her own experience and her own emotion. So I think it's interesting to kind of get Nicola's interpretation of Donna's life, and then we as readers get to see what was actually going on in Donna's life, since we're getting more than just the letters. Is any of this making sense? I don't know. This is a really wonderful book though, and I just love the way that it played with form, and I love the ideas that it presented, and I thought that it was really engaging and beautifully written. So I can't wait to see what else Hannah Regel does, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go and pick this up from Verso. And then another 5-star read, The Story of a New Name by Elena Ferrante. Oh my god, you guys. I get it now, okay? I get the Neapolitan novel hype, and I've talked to so many people on Instagram whenever I was posting about this that have also echoed my thoughts and feelings on this. I'm not gonna get super into the weeds as far as like the plot here, just because this is the second book in the series. I don't want to give anything away, but this was such a whirlwind. I read the first book in the series, My Brilliant Friend, last summer, and I liked it. I thought that it was fine, but I was like, I don't understand why everyone is so obsessed with these books. It just did not fully like draw me in the way that I was expecting it to, given everyone else's opinions of it. So that's why I waited a whole entire year to start the second book, and as soon as I started this, I was like, oh, I get it now. From the very first page of this book, Ferrante comes out swinging. It is so intense, And I think I literally like updated on Goodreads. I was like, she is just not holding back. Like, I'm only 50 pages in, and this is like almost 500 pages, and I'm like, how is she gonna keep going from here? It's so early on. I feel like the stakes are so much higher here than they were in the first book. You know, the first book is following Lenu and Lila throughout their childhood, and we're seeing their friendship kind of grow and the beginnings of the hardships that they're going to be facing. But I think since they were children, it just didn't make as much of an impact on me. But in this book, they are now like young women, and I feel like the character development was just like turned up to 10. Everything just felt so much higher stakes, and it was just so intense. They start to navigate marriage, infidelity, pregnancy, poverty, and abuse that we see in the neighborhood, even in the first book. And they really just try to take their futures into their own hands, and it is so gripping to read about. There's this kind of push and pull in their relationship, where sometimes they're really close with each other, sometimes they're not, depending on the circumstances in their lives at the time. And it's really heartwarming at times. It's also really frustrating at times, because you just want better for them, and you just want them to communicate with each other and overcome the issues that they're having. But you can also see how, given the circumstances, that could be really difficult. It really is such a vivid picture of the intricacies of female friendship and just how relationships change over a lifetime. One of the things I was really worried about going into this book was that I wouldn't remember enough from My Brilliant Friend, the first book, and I was really worried I was going to get just absolutely lost and confused in here. But luckily there is like the character list that tells you all about the different families at the beginning of the book. And I feel like Ferrante does a good job at providing context within the story. You know, she'll kind of say like, oh, his sister or her brother or whatever, and it kind of allows you to find your footing within the huge cast of characters here. And I found that I remembered a lot more than I was expecting to. There were a lot of scenes that ended up actually being like seared into my brain from the first book, and I wasn't expecting that. So that was kind of nice to find that I had retained more than I expected. Oh yeah, this was just such a good book. Perfect book to get lost in as things start to heat up this summer. A lot of people have also picked this up around this time, and it's been really fun to see like the comments on my community tab. I had posted about it, and so many people were also reading it. So yeah, we're all on the same wavelength here. So good. I am like trying to figure out if I want to read the third book this summer or if I want to wait until next summer. I don't know yet. I think I'm gonna try and give myself a bit of a break just so that I don't burn myself out, but maybe later on in the summer we'll start book 3. I don't know. I have a quote from this too. I actually have a lot of quotes. I dog-eared a lot of pages in here. But one that I feel like really just encapsulates the vibes of the book says, "If nothing could save us, not money, not a male body, and not even studying, we might as well destroy everything immediately." Her rage expanded in my breast, a force that was mine and not mine, filling me with the pleasure of losing myself. Read these books, guys. Just do it. The final book that I read in June was Black Vodka, which is a short story collection by Deborah Levy. This was a 3-star for me, you guys. The short story form has defeated me once again. If you know me, you know that Deborah Levy is one of my favorite authors, so I thought that this would be a good pickup for me, and it just ultimately fell flat for me, and I think it's because it was a short story collection. I historically have struggled with short story collections, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. These were like, I wouldn't even consider these stories, some of them. They were very short vignettes and kind of scenes. I read this while I was at the airport waiting for my flight to Chicago, And it was really good for that because they're so short. I was able to dip in and out of them, and I was able to pause and like talk to my friends or go get food or whatever. So it was good for that setting, but I don't think that the actual stories are really going to stick with me at all. My friend, hi mom, if you're watching, she was reading some of them over my shoulder while we were sitting together on the plane, which was like a very funny experience. I suddenly felt very self-conscious because she was like looking, and I was like, I don't know what Deborah Levy's got in here. But she just kind of pointed out that all of these stories were just like about sad people having affairs. And there just really wasn't that much to care about in here, and we couldn't really find the lessons that we were supposed to take from them. And after we finished each one, we were just kind of like, why? Like, what is the point? And yeah, it just wasn't my favorite from Levy. I think that what Levy does really well is creating these really like eccentric and weird characters, but because this book was so brief, she didn't really get a chance to flesh anyone out and make you get to know them, and so it just kind of fell flat. The positive thing that I will give Deb in this situation is that there's some really great sentences in here. I think on a sentence level, it's really good writing. I love Deborah Levy's style. I think she has this really biting voice and kind of sparse prose, and it just really always works for me no matter if I'm reading her nonfiction or her fiction. I think she has a really unique way of portraying emotions that kind of takes you by surprise. It's very different, but you read it and you're like, oh my god, yeah, like that makes so much sense. So it is kind of relatable at the same time. So I really enjoyed finding those sentences and just like these combinations of words and ideas that I thought were really wonderful. It kind of felt like a bit of a treasure hunt in the like middle of the road narratives. So those were good little tidbits for me to find in the overall kind of meh experience. So I think if you're a Deborah Levy completionist like me, then this is like fine to pick up at the airport or something like that. But if you're not really interested in reading all of Deborah Levy's books, I would say stick with her novels and her living autobiography. But one of the sentences that I absolutely loved in here, and that I had seen someone post on an Instagram story a couple months ago, and that's what kind of made me want to prioritize this. I think that it's in the first story in the book. I think it is also about an affair. She says, "It is usual for people attracted to each other to pretend they have full and busy lives, but I have an incredible facility to wade through human shame with no shoes on." I was like, that is such an interesting way to put it. I really love it. I feel like a lot of people can relate to that feeling of wading through shame with no shoes on. So yeah, that was my reading experience in June. 9 books. I feel like it was a solid month overall. I don't know if that's really reflected in the star ratings. I feel like I had some kind of lower 3-star experiences, but I'm happy with the reading month. I think it definitely picked up towards the end of the month with The Story of a New Name and The Last Sane Woman, so I'm really happy with having discovered those, and I am hoping that July will be even better. It's July 6th. I've already read 3 books. Like I said, I am kind of using reading as like escapism currently, and I'm just really using it as a way to get off my phone and just kind of get lost in a book. So I'm moving through them pretty fast. So yeah, I hope you guys had a wonderful June. Let me know what you read throughout the month. Let me know what your favorites were. Let me know if you have any thoughts on the things that I read, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.